Hi, everyone. Lianne Bridges here. I'm so excited to be here with David Freiheit, aka Viva Fry. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm a speaker, author, and the founder of Designing Transformation. My work really focuses on helping support change leaders fulfill their mission and live their potential. And I have such an amazing change leader with me today, going to be talking about what's going on. So let me just give you a quick introduction, and I'll let David introduce himself. But he calls himself a litigator turned YouTuber, and I think now turned political candidate. He's running for the NDG Westmount riding for the PPC. For those of you who don't know, that's the People's Party of Canada that was formed by Maxime Bernier in 2018. And I love what you have on your party's website. He says that he left the Conservative Party of Canada because he realized that they were too intellectually and morally corrupt to reform, having abandoned conservative principles long ago. So this is one of the things I love about David and the whole party is they're just really outspoken. They say it like it is. But before we go there, David is born and raised in Montreal, like myself. He's a father, husband, and patriot who never thought he would find himself running for political office. So David, welcome, and please tell us why you are running. And maybe just step back one, why did you leave an illustrious career as a litigator to become a YouTuber, and now this is amazing. Talk about change.
Well, okay, you know what? One thing before I forget, the leaving the Conservative Party to found their own was Maxime Bernier. I was never politically affiliated to any party. I was never, I have voted Liberal in my life. I voted Conservative. I have voted throw away my ballots because I was angry with the candidates. So I came from no political affiliation. I'm a no man, I'm in no man's land, political no man's land, where I always went, I like to think, by the quality of the candidate and not by party affiliation, because it is not party over country, it's principles over party. But now, okay, so starting from the beginning, how did I leave litigation? Sworn in 2007, and I practiced litigation at one of Canada's biggest law firms, Borden Ladner Gervais, for about 5 or 6 years. I decided after my first kid that the lifestyle, the schedule was not one I wanted to, be living in a decade. So after the first born was born, about 8 months into it, call it a midlife crisis or a Friday afternoon break, I quit. I mean, I told I couldn't maintain this schedule. I couldn't maintain this lifestyle. It wasn't bringing me any pleasure. So I left thinking I was going to go to Dawson College for commercial photography. And I actually applied, except before I could get put on the waiting list and ultimately rejected, I started getting calls to practice law. So I started taking in, within a month, I have more work than I know what to do with. I rent out a small office on the corner of St. Catherine and Green because you can't do this type of law out of your house. You don't want service of documents at your house. And I ran that into a successful boutique litigation firm. At one point, we had 4 or 5 lawyers. My father, a couple years into my founding Freiheit Legal, left Stikeman Elliott, and we started working together, except I never liked the practice of litigation any more one day than I did the day before. And at one point I said, look, I've started exploring YouTube. I created this YouTube channel in 2014. In 2016, I said, I'm going to wind down my litigation, try to pursue, at the time it was basically media advertising, marketing, social media marketing. And then what ended up happening, my channel turned into a legal channel where everyone was saying, we like your law-themed videos. We like a day in the life of a lawyer. Do more of those. It ended up turning into legal analysis. And that's when the channel really took off and became something sustainable. How did I get into politics? 2 years after a lockdown. And you see what the government has basically done with what were supposed to be fundamental rights and liberties. And I was breaking down lawsuits, talking about the unconstitutionality of some of these measures, courts in various jurisdictions intervening more or less. And I became very critical of what I perceived to be the inadequate, constitutionally indefensible government response to this pandemic. And after a year or so of complaining, people said, put your money where your mouth is. And I said, if I'm going to end up in Florida or Texas or a country where a country or state that I think personifies freedom, I'm going to try to save my country before I run for my country. And so I said, the joke was, I told Maxime Bernier, I said, you have to let me run on this cash line, basically, which is I'm going to run for my country before I run from my country. And you have to let me say, never in a million years did I ever want to go from the toxic environment of commercial litigation to the toxic environment of politics. But when I see quite literally the future of my children and their friends being compromised by draconian government measures, no option.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel the exact same way. I feel that pull to leave and then wanting to do something here. And I think what's happening as more and more measures take place, more people are waking up or standing up. You know, for me, I started out at the beginning of the pandemic speaking out and got a whole bunch of criticism, and I kind of retreated, you know, and then I was following and sharing people like yourself. And then finally, when the mandates was announced, I was like, okay, I cannot stand for this anymore. I have to speak up, you know?
It is amazing. And I started off naive and wet behind the ears thinking, okay, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. All right, it's become 2 months. Let's make the most of it. We had a good time with the family. You know, we made videos for my second YouTube channel. We had adventures. We made the best of it.
Yeah.
But when the initial premise of 2 weeks to flatten the curve so as not to overwhelm the healthcare facilities turned into lockdowns, shutting down businesses, locking you in your homes, denying who you could have in your homes, forced masks, forced vaccinations, then all the while simultaneously the government actually doing nothing to remedy the initial problem, which was how do you not overwhelm the healthcare system, when they're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars on COVID ads and not hospital infrastructure. And then 2 years later, you're in the exact same position of a problem. Our healthcare system can't deal with it. So now it's forced vaccinations, more forced lockdowns, and these draconian measures have become standard government protocol. I mean, it's unacceptable, is an understatement. It's not a free or democratic society, what we're living in, and what the government has now come to terms with what it can get away with imposing on the citizens.
And so it feels like this is a super important election, if maybe not one of the most important elections. I think it's important for Canadians. I think it's important worldwide as each stage around the world steps up, does things, people revolt, the rest of the world is watching. Do you feel this is a really important election? If so?
I mean, I know everybody says every election is the most important, but even in retrospect now, I can appreciate that 2016 in the US was a more existentially important election than 2020, because I think once you get a bit of the pushback, then you get sort of a breathing space where, you know, Trump can lose 2020, but there'll be a more pushback politically for 2024. As far as it goes in Canada, I can't think of any election in the history of Canada that would be more important and more, I say, potentially cataclysmic, or at least potentially relevant than this. And I'm saying that without exaggeration. I think it's safe to say, if, I won't say God forbid, but if the Liberals get a majority government, and the only opposition are people who agree with the Liberals, but less so, we look at losing whatever free and democratic country we ever thought Canada was in the first place. You're looking at a prime minister who, talk about an about face is not harsh enough of a term. 6 months ago saying, you know, forced vaccination is not Canadian. What about people with health issues, allergies, religious convictions? 6 months later, when he's gotten the taste and lust for power, is now saying, if you don't get vaccinated, you're free not to get vaccinated, but don't expect to get on a train or a plane or have a federal job or earn a livelihood or whatever. I mean,
go to school.
If we go to, I mean, we'll get into the demographics issue, because this is, if it's not disguised racism, it's certainly tolerating racist policies and discriminatory policies, but we'll get there in a sec. But if this government has that mandate, has their actions confirmed by enough Canadians, okay, we'll end up with the Canada that Canadians vote for. So I do think this is the most important election, because it's not just about which party remains in power. It's about what principles of governance get affirmed or denied by the population. And if too many people are okay with what the government is doing, that's going to spell the future of Canada.
I love it, because that was what I wanted to ask you. What is the most important issue? is, you know, understand of this election. It's understanding what is it, what do people want? Are they willing to accept what's coming down, that what they've already got and what they'll continue to get?
Are,
How would you
are they
explain the
willing to
most important?
the question, are they willing to sacrifice every right that was ever deemed fundamental for the prospect of security, for the impression, for the feeling of security? Because one thing's for certain, nothing that the government has actually done, well, I won't say nothing, that might be too much of an exaggeration. Very few of the constitutionally offensive measures have actually managed to keep people any safer than had they not been in place.
Mhm.
And at the same time as the government is trampling constitutional rights, they are literally neglecting the infrastructure and the people who are the most vulnerable. And so it's great, you know, the government takes swift action, and Trudeau said something like, we need to make hard decisions. Well, making hard decisions is different than making right decisions. And oftentimes bad decisions feel hard because they're bad decisions. And so locking down the non-vulnerable, the people who need to be working in order to pay the taxes, to maintain the infrastructure, who need to be working the jobs to protect the vulnerable, well, you lock down everybody, and then you end up exacerbating the problem with the most vulnerable, while simultaneously not doing anything to better protect anybody. And so hard decisions are not good because they're hard. Good decisions might be hard, but hard decisions are not necessarily good. And making bad, hard decisions is not praiseworthy just because they're hard, which is what this government seems to think. Hey, it's hard for us to lock you in your house after 8 o'clock for 5 months. It's hard for us to impose a curfew on you. Even though we think and have stated that there's no scientific basis to say that it's going to help anything, it's hard for us. Well, that doesn't make it a good decision, nor does it make it a justifiable decision.
It's amazing. Why do you think, you know, you've come out and you've said that you're vaccinated, which I think in some ways gives you even more credibility on this topic. So I want to ask you, what would you say to other people who have made that choice, who think that this is not an issue for them?
I
Mandates are not
I
an
didn't
issue.
want to. I did not want to come out and say it because
Yeah,
I don't want anybody thinking that I'm trying to pressure them,
yeah.
shame them, influence them whatsoever. It's not my. I know people think like influencers should go out and influence and tell people to make medical decisions. It's not my decision. It's not my advice to give.
Yeah,
And the only reason why I'd say I'm always transparent, but the only reason I came out and said this, whereas I think it's
because it's
none of
private.
anyone's effing business,
Yeah, exactly.
99% of the time, it's none of your business. There's an acronym in there. It's nobody's business. Nobody's vaccination status is anybody's business. The only reason why I felt morally required to disclose it publicly is because I do publicly criticize a lot of policies, which I could be called a hypocrite
Yeah.
or deceitful if I publicly defend or criticize certain policies and then do not disclose what many might be feel to be a relevant fact or factor to espousing those beliefs. But the ultimate irony is just like you tell people you're double vaccinated, that you don't oppose vaccinations, but you oppose a vaccine passport, and they still call you anti-vaxxer. That's the level of intellectual dishonesty or lack of self-reflection that we are currently living through.
And
It's
if I could
mind-boggling.
add,
Mind-boggling.
yeah, and I think that there's a big group of people like you that I would call almost in the middle, who really are exactly where you're at. And I went to the march last Saturday. I think you were there,
Yep.
and Maxime and so forth. And I'm sure there were so many people that were both vaxxed and not vaxxed, but they were against the mandates and the continued lockdowns and that kind of thing.
There are I don't call them extremists. There are elements on both sides who say shame on you for not getting vaxxed, and then there's others who say shame on you for succumbing to the pressure. Anybody shaming anybody for a decision which is fundamentally personal is just as wrong on both ends.
I agree. 100%.
But the idea it's a personal choice. I do appreciate that a lot of people are in fact being coerced economically, socially, politically into doing it, and they don't want to, and they wouldn't do it, but for the pressure they wouldn't, and that's a very big problem.
Yes.
But ultimately, everyone's decision to do it is their own. I'm not in a position to tell people to do it or tell people not to do it because they have their doctors, and that's what doctors are for.
Mhm.
So all these politicians and all these social media giants telling people to take a medical procedure. I mean, it's. I know they're going to say the science is there, but every individual has unique traits, unique medical histories, that should consult their own doctors and get their advice from them. But so that's why I did it. I also have my own neuroses. I mean, I know that I will fear irrational things, and if I did not get vaccinated and then I got someone sick, I would feel guilty, even if it's irrational. But again, these are my issues, and anybody can feel free to disagree with them. So I did it. Maxime did not do it, and that's what I love about the party, is that the irony: Maxime is more pro-choice. The PPC is more pro-choice than the Liberal Party.
This is the irony that's happening right now, right? Is but I'm wondering what you say to people who don't think it's an issue for them, the mandates, let's say, and the increased control, because they've chosen, as you have, and they can get their passport. What do you say to them? Why this should be important to them?
Well, but there's two things. They won't care until they realize that, until they get rejected from a gym or a coffee shop because they didn't realize fully vaccinated now includes a booster that they didn't get. They won't care until they come for their 11-year-old or 6-year-old kids, because now they say, yeah, we've tested it, it's safe. Now we're going to impose this two-tier class system on your children or your grandchildren. They won't care until they go out with their kids or their grandkids, and their kids can't get in somewhere and feel this social shame that they should have never felt in the first place. And the ultimate irony being, if the vaccine works, the vaccine passport is useless. If the vaccine doesn't work, then the vaccine passport is useless. And talking about the moving goalposts and the discrete manner in which the objectives change, we were told 2 weeks to flatten the curve, just bear with us, you'll get your life back. 2 years later, we're told, just get double vaccinated, 70% of the population, you'll get your lives back. And not only does that not happen, they come in with increasingly stringent, more invasive, more right violating conditions to get your normal back. And at some point, people have to say, like, life entails risk. Life is finite. Life, like Tyler Durden said in Fight Club, on a long enough timeline, everyone's life expectancy eventually hits zero. We have to appreciate
exactly.
that everything we're doing now might be reducing the COVID number, but necessarily has offsetting, that's not the word I'm looking for, other consequences, which we're not yet factoring in. And that investigation into the old person home deaths, the long-term healthcare facility deaths, where they said, we know how many people are dying from COVID, but we don't know how many people are dying from neglect, starvation, and malnourishment, because we're not counting that number. Well, that's a great way to determine whether or not what you're doing is actually exacerbating a problem and causing greater other problems, and not actually solving the problem.
And exactly. And by the way, what are they doing? My son is in the Army Reserve, and he went in last April and May, June, into the residence. He was recruited and worked for 2 months in the residences here in Montreal. He saw firsthand what was going on, and he's talked about the neglect was unbelievable. And the level of sanitation, mushrooms growing from kitchen floors, where they were cooking food, from fungus. I mean, people who were working there, taking off their masks, eating right next to the COVID person. Just the stuff that was going on. And then, luckily, in a way, the military was there because they were taking checks and balances, but then they left. Like, what happened? Did we change anything?
We knew that the healthcare system was strained before the pandemic. And I mean, this is something I've said time and time again. People really need to understand this. This is not, well, we're exaggerating. 2018 in Ontario, Toronto, many hospitals had to suspend elective surgeries because the flu season was so bad. In 2018, I think it was 68,000 people in the United States died. Nobody batted an eye. In Canada, we've known that our healthcare system is, I won't say underfunded, because it's funded, it's amazingly, how much money it requires, but it's had systemic problems, and we've known it for years, if not decades. And so, yes, the pandemic certainly exacerbated existing problems, but what have we done for the last 2 years to incentivize people to go work in the healthcare system, to bring back the doctors, the brain drain that we've experienced in Canada, and more so in Quebec, because in Quebec, people get trained, they go out, elsewhere in Canada, and in Canada overall, they get trained, and then they go to the States because they get paid better there, the working conditions are amazing. So we suffer this brain drain on all fronts. We knew the healthcare system had problems for years, if not decades. But Parkinson's law of government being what it is, it's easier to pretend to solve a simple problem as opposed to actually address the more complex one. For anybody who doesn't know, Parkinson's law of mundanity, great economist, the theory of Parkinson's law of mundanity is that a boardroom full of, powerful people in a company will spend an hour talking about where to place the water cooler because everyone has an opinion on that. But when it comes to how to increase shareholder value, they'll gloss over that issue because it's complex and nobody can really truly understand it in order to solve the problem. And you have that in government. You have Parkinson's law of government, where the government, instead of solving the actual underlying serious problem, the weakness in our healthcare system, says, forget it, we're just going to lock you guys in your home. That's a lot easier than dealing with our own incompetence.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. My late husband was named Parkinson. So when you say that, I smiled because I know the Parkinson's laws pretty well, and he was a very wise man.
He was amazing principles. I never read any books thoroughly. I just read articles and summaries, but people sometimes think I'm talking about Parkinson's as in the disease, but no, it's Parkinson's law. He was an economist and he had some great principles.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that I want to ask you about, and I actually want to take a quote from something that was a comment on one of my posts, but I want to how you respond to people saying that you, me, whomever are talking about this are exaggerating with offensive hyperbole. I'm just going to give you one quote if you don't mind me just taking a minute. This person said, using labels such as medical, which I used, medical apartheid, segregation, censorship, authoritarian, might offend some immigrants who came from countries where these were real and might feel offended by the comparison with what is happening right now in Canada, which is very harmless compared to the horrors some immigrants had endured at home. How do you respond?
Well, you know what I respond to that? First of all, I don't know if this person who wrote that comment is in fact one of those immigrants who came from those tyrannical, oppressive societies.
Her family did, yes. Her family did.
Okay, well, she's entitled to feel the way she feels, but I discuss with everybody, and I have friends who came from communist Hungary. And I've been discussing this with them over the last couple of years. And at first they were saying, yeah, it's a little exaggerating. We're all in an emergency panic mode. A year later, they're saying, no, this is exactly what it smelt like when it happened in Hungary. This is exactly what it smelt like when it happened in Venezuela. There was someone who's running for the PPC from Venezuela. Says, I left this, what I see happening here in Venezuela. And I don't want to disclose anything that could be remotely revealing of an identity, but people who came from the most oppressive areas in the world as refugees, who also say, I'm starting to see it here, I'm starting to smell it here, and it doesn't look good, and this is how it starts. So first of all, when someone says, I find this offensive, my typical response is, well, being offended doesn't mean you're right. In fact, typically being offended means you've abandoned reason to resort to emotion in order to win a point that can't be won by reason. So forget whether or not you're offended. Let's just deal with the facts. In any society in the world where a government has locked people in their houses after 8 o'clock, imposed a curfew, told them they have to take medical procedures in order to benefit from privileges, which I still think are fundamental rights, has talked about a QR code to scan citizens to determine who can enter businesses and who cannot, knowing full well, incidentally, that the statistics of vaccination vary wildly among minorities compared to others. So you go to New York, where I believe it's something like 25% of the Black population in the US is vaccinated or fully vaccinated, compared to 75% of the white population. And you're talking about precluding these people, the unvaccinated, from entering businesses. You may as well just have a sign that targets ethnic minorities, because that is the actual impact of these arbitrary measures. So whether or not it's exaggerated, it doesn't have to be the worst example on earth in order to be analogous to the worst example on earth. And it doesn't have to be the worst example on earth in order to be morally and fundamentally objectionable on its face. We are at a stage now where, it's not 1945 Germany, or not, I should say 1939 Germany. It's not communist Russia. It's not Mao's China. And it doesn't have to be in order to be fundamentally offensive and shock the conscience as far as it goes in countries that say or purport to have a constitution and guarantee constitutional rights to the citizens.
Oh, I love you speak so eloquently. I wish I could speak the way you do. It's so perfect. I really like that. And I would say just further to what you were saying about the people that I have met and know that come from kind of former communist countries and so forth. They're the most outspoken.
Mhm.
One after the other. A friend of mine who came through Montreal escaped from an East Bloc country in the late 80s before the wall came down. She was on her way to Cuba. She didn't tell any of her friends she was leaving. They landed in Montreal to refuel, and they were in a holding cell, so to speak, in the airport, the Trudeau airport. And there were guns and everything like that. She told her fiance at the time, he didn't even know she was going to try to escape. She told him, I'm going to leave. There was a door that said you can't exit, whatever. She goes, I'm running for that door. And there's guns and everything in the Montreal airport. Can you imagine? She took off, and the guys were yelling at her. Her husband ended up following her, 8 other people, and they got through. And they landed in Montreal in Canada, and she stayed ever since. And it's been amazing. But she and so many people I've met through her say what's happening now is exactly or very similar or smells, as you said, of what happened there. I left that to come here. And then what she says further is that, and this is an interesting idea, Canadians have never experienced that before. And most Canadians have lived under freedom and so forth. And the idea that, what is it, good times create weak men and women.
It is hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create bad times.
Exactly. So we're in that kind of process. We look at Canada, how wonderful and free. And I think about a few years ago, my same son I was talking about was like 15 or 16, and he was talking about this is where it's going. And I would argue with him, no way, we've learned from history. There's not a chance. We have constitution, we have all this, so we'll never have.
Well, we've seen what our constitution is worth. We've seen what it's worth when a federal court upholds mandatory detention in quarantine facilities because the infinitesimal risk that an individual tests negative upon entry, but then subsequently tests positive, is within the next 2 weeks, as it might be possible, is sufficient to justify forced detention in a federal facility called a quarantine hotel. And once you realize that that's the risk that can justify violating any charter right under the first section of the charter, which says all of these rights are guaranteed and inviolable, except in as much can be justified in a free and democratic society. Once you realize that that's the justification to justify forced detention, we effectively might have, if it's the only silver lining, we might have realized that we don't have rights in Canada, and it's time to either acknowledge that and learn to live with it and then see what society degrades into or devolves into, or say, no, it's not okay. But for anybody who says, it's not Nazi Germany, it's not communism, it's not Mao's China. It isn't. But it doesn't have to be that in order to be offensive. The idea that the government thinks that they can compel children to wear face masks for 8 hours a day in school because of the risks, which are not very well defined, if there are any meaningful risks at all of transmission of a virus. There is no limit to what they're going to do. And once they start saying that children aged 12 to 17, in order to benefit from after-school activities, benefit from a normal life of an adolescent, have to take 2 vaccines of an emergency authorization use experimental vaccine, as it is still called by the National Institute of Health, non-FDA approved. If this is the new free society, there's no free society. And you either just say, I accept that I'm not living in a free society, but it's going to make me feel safer, or you're going to say, I will live with certain risks to the extent that it guarantees certain fundamental rights. And these are personal decisions, which is why I say this election cycle is going to show us who's on board with what. And between the Liberals, the NDP, and now the Conservatives, we're talking about birds of the same feather. The only difference is how big the bird is.
And I think we've seen this through the last year and a half, because there's been no opposition really to this.
No, the Conservatives, I say, they should not be opposition because they're conservatives. They should not be constitutional right supporters because they're conservative. Nobody in government is supporting the constitutional rights of the citizens. And why do they need to worry about it? They've seen that society will agree to be locked down, shut down, have your businesses closed down, living off a government stipend, while the people making these decisions are cashing every single paycheck from your tax dollars, while the medical officers who are saying, yeah, we need to lock down a little more, are getting paid $300,000, $400,000 a year, not missing a paycheck. They're taking their trips to the Barbados, to the islands. They're crossing borders to mingle with their family. They're going to protests. What, you know, where is their skin in this game that they should actually live by what they're imposing on others in order maybe to see how absolutely unjustifiable it is? There's been no party except the People's Party of Canada, which is ultimately how, you know, how I was, life has pushed me in that direction. And then it's only in looking at the PPC's other principles, I say, yeah, they are basically common sense government. And we basically have a government that thinks it's my father, quite literally.
Before we go into some of the other parts of the party, how did we get here? I know the issues of the pandemic and all that kind of stuff and fear, but how did we get to what most Canadians would thought we had a constitution protecting, or Americans and so forth? The Western world thought we had rights and freedoms that were protected, and to a point where, you know, as a lawyer and someone expert in law, how do we get to this point where one after the other, like us laymen are looking like, how come these are passing through the courts? How come this is happening?
It's amazing. This I've noticed, and you know, I'm not a comparative law expert. I just have my experience now analyzing US law. In the US, they say that, you know, the idea of their constitution is that their rights are given to them by God and the government does not give them to them.
Right.
In Canada, we're subjects. It's the government that grants us these rights, which effectively makes them mere government privileges, which might explain why the Canadians have been much more docile, not just through the pandemic, but even leading up to it, in allowing the government to chisel away from our rights. You know, it starts with things like hate speech, which people say, yeah, okay, fine. People don't need to be able to say hateful things. All right, now it becomes, you know, the gender issues. All right, people should respect other people's preferred gender pronouns. And then it gets into things where people are like, well, wait a minute, I can't leave my house at 8 o'clock. Or, well, the ultimate irony, in Quebec, the English population starts getting constitutionally savvy when Francois Legault says, yeah, we're going to do that Bill 96 and it's going to infringe on some of your linguistic rights. And then every you know, a lot of English Canadians are like, English Quebecers are saying, well, what about my linguistic rights? To which I respond to them, you spent the last 2 years giving away more fundamental rights than that. Why did you think the government was going to stop with your language rights? You let the government lock you in your house at night. You think he cares what language you think you want to speak? So once you get into the habit of giving them away, the government gets into the habit of taking them under various pretexts, all of which typically involve your better being, your well-being. But it started a long time ago. Yeah. And I'm pushing, because even before I knew any of this, you know, my American sub base would always say, you have no free speech in Canada. You don't have gun rights. You don't have self-defense rights. And now I'm fully appreciating that, yeah, maybe the writing was on the wall from a little bit earlier, but they broke out the spray paint with the pandemic. And now it's quite clear. The government doesn't think we have any rights. They are all privileges and thinks that they are not just my father, but because even my father, you know, couldn't lock me in a house after 8 o'clock. They think they are our overlord rulers, and that we have no autonomy and no fundamental rights and no right to exist without their approval. And that's a very big problem. And that's what's on the table this election.
What's driving that, do you think? What is it, a personal need for power or money? What is driving that?
At the end of the day, you watch my channel. I say I don't often argue intentions. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Trudeau's doing it because he wants a seat on the World Economic Forum. If he wants to, be chummy with the billionaires at Davos.
Right?
It doesn't matter if he's doing it because he genuinely thinks he's doing good. It doesn't matter.
Right, that makes sense for sure.
And also, I'll never be able to prove it. Hypothesizing on them unless it's totally relevant to go after the intentions of the person, which might be the case with some of the mainstream media, CNN reporters I sometimes to take shots at on Twitter. But by and large, hypothesizing on intentions will allow you to demonize the person, but it doesn't add to the debate. The outcome is the same.
That's really well said. So if the party gets elected, what would be their stance on helping through this difficult time? What would be your approach?
Well, see, at one point they want to balance. They had said they wanted to balance the budget within a couple of years, but I suspect that was before the $1 trillion deficit that we've worked ourselves into during this crisis. The bottom line: freedom is the ultimate good. and when people talk about the greater good, individual freedom is the greater good, because the alternative invariably leads to bad places. So where do you even start with this? Unfortunately, you have to start by, I say unfortunately, for the government, you have to start by backing off and shrinking a little bit, and let people run their lives, let people benefit from their individual freedoms to make the decisions for themselves, because the government can't sustain itself by micromanaging every aspect of citizen life. It's it's sort of like playing poker at a casino, where if everybody sits down at the table with $100, eventually that money just goes to the house through the rake. So you can't just sit there playing with the same fixed 100. When you're talking about government micromanaging everything, the government takes its cut and people have to bring new money in. So when it comes to an economy, there has to be more independence, smaller government, less regulation on certain things, not vital things. But like Bill 96 is a good example, applying the French language laws to small businesses. Until someone's run their own small business, they don't appreciate in the neck additional costs that these measures typically require, and they just end up being vehicles for fines and penalties to the governments without any benefit to the individuals or the companies. But that's a long way to answer. The bottom line, to start walking, we have to start getting government spending under control, and we have to start giving people their freedoms back so they can go out, make a living, through which they will pay taxes to the government to maintain the infrastructure. That's the simplest way of putting it.
I love it. And when we talk actually about health in particular, because there are a lot of people who are still afraid of what's going on, and they may feel that there still is some need to protect from a government perspective, whether it's protecting the most vulnerable or other things. Is there anything that your party is coming out with as a way to kind of help them feel more comfortable? Or maybe that's not the purpose of what you're trying to do.
No, I don't know if there's a formal party policy on this, but I've been saying from the beginning, there are going to be people now, 2 years of incessant fear porn coming from the mainstream media and the government. Street signs. I was driving back from a cottage today. There were literally those what do they call them when you have lights? Street signs.
Yeah.
There's the street signs every 300 meters. COVID, be careful. 2 meter distancing on the streets. It's one thing to be in a pandemic and know that it's going on. I think there's not a person on earth who doesn't appreciate that that's the world in which we live. Yeah. The idea of putting out these, and again, I go back to Vegas, these stimulating fear lights every 30 meters, every signs everywhere, big red lights. People have been traumatized for the last 2 years. And there's going to be a lot of people who are going to have, I am going to call it an irrational fear, because it is statistically exaggerated as compared to the actual risk. And it's going to be tough to get some of those people to appreciate the actual risks and to go back to a normal, because they're going to feel too vulnerable. Yes. For those people who may be sufficiently traumatized, you can work accommodations and okay, if you don't want to go back to work, instead of locking everyone down and giving everyone $2,000 a month, a lot of people want to get back to work. If you're too traumatized, we'll work on literally a program so that we can accommodate you and also try to reintegrate, because bottom line also, people are not going to live like this for the rest of their lives, and you're not going to eradicate any virus. It's just impossible. So you are going to have to learn to live with certain risks, but it can't be the government that spent 2 years traumatizing you now telling you, finally, you're going to have to get used to some of the risk. It's going to take reconditioning, but above all else, it's going to take a media that's going to report accurately on the actual risks, as opposed to focusing on the one guy who was vocally anti-vaccine, got COVID and died, and now they've just traumatized everyone to say, if you don't get the vaccine, you're going to die. Or trying to think, or the double vaccinated who mingled with someone else, got COVID and died. People have to appreciate the statistics and all this, which you can't appreciate the actual statistics when you've been utterly blinded by a sweeping fear.
Absolutely. And why, I know you don't want to talk about intention. Maybe you can talk about strategic direction. Why do you think is there Trudeau called a snap election like this? Maybe you think what the benefit.
The funny thing is, well, so that's if we're going by what the conservatives think, or there's another Canadian YouTuber, JJ McCullough, who says typically snap elections end in a net benefit to the government who called it, because people want stability, so they want to vote for a majority. I got to tell you, I'm so politically, I wanted Trudeau to call an election, because that's the first step that we have to let him know that we want him out of power. The fact that he thinks, or that, you know, general consensus is that he thinks this is going to be beneficial to him. Either I'm living in my own silo, or he's living in his own silo, because I cannot see the liberals coming out with a net positive after all of this. But what do I know? But yeah, I presume he called the election and called it with the shortest possible delay. Not necessarily because he thinks he's going to get a majority, but at the very least, he's been planning for this for a lot longer than, let's just say, the PPC or other parties. Although I did find it interesting that the NDP had their signs up the day they called the election, which means there had to have been some consensus internally. They knew they were going to go to an election. But no, presumably he's calling it because he thinks it's going to be a net benefit. At the very least, he thinks the delay is going to be strategically beneficial for him as opposed to others. And then you can get into all sorts of other reasons, mail-in voting and yada, 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 which I don't get into because, again, can't prove or disprove any of it. But I'm glad he called the election. I let people get to the polls, and I just hope, to my heart of hearts, that what I think is my feel for the lay of the land, because I do reach millions of people a month. I reach with them, you know, on social media, but I also talk with people privately. I mean, I talk to everybody all the time. I like talking. I get the impression that there's a lot of people who are extremely angry and extremely frustrated, and now are becoming extremely concerned because they see where this is going, not just for them, but for their kids and their kids' kids. And they want change, and they want to head to the polls. So I hope I'm right in what I think is the undercurrent, the silent majority that is going to turn out for opposition. The only question is, who's the opposition? NDP? NDP is more left than liberals. The Conservatives, talking about opposing Bill C-10, or sorry, repealing Bill C-10 if they get elected, as opposed to opposing Bill C-10 before it gets enacted. Bill C-10 is that regulating the internet the same way the Broadcasting Act regulates television and radio. So the Conservatives are non-opposition. They're just less radical. They're just less extreme than the liberals. So I just hope that people turn out to the PPC, get a few seats in the House, so we have an official opposition that is an actual opposition. And who knows, maybe even more. Maybe I get my punum in the in Parliament, and I can take my vocal criticism of the government to the actual government itself.
Well, and the Conservative government, because I was following them through the last year, they came out with somebody in their group came out with a petition against the mandates, and now they're supporting them. So how do you come out with a petition?
If they did not, if they didn't have double standards, they would have no standards at all. I put together what I think is a pretty poignant soundbite on Twitter, Viva Fry, if anybody that follows me on Twitter. Trudeau literally saying, I don't know if it was 6 months ago, a year ago, what about people with allergies, medical conditions, religious sensitivities? We are not a country that compels vaccination. 6 months later, you people with allergies, medical conditions, or religious convictions can't get on a bus or a plane. What is that? Well, I mean, they have no standards. They have no core principles. And I'm not even sure that this is unique to the liberals. I think this is probably true to most politicians. It's certainly true to the Conservatives as well. They have no core principles. And you got Aaron O'Toole, who now sees Canada, I guess he perceives Canada to be turning left. So he says, okay, well, we can get more left with the Conservatives. So we'll go along with the carbon tax. We'll go along with the Paris Accord. We'll just be a little less strict about it. Politicians say this. I say this knowing what I'm doing in life, but I'm stubborn, and I live as though God is always watching, and I live as though someone is always recording. So I don't want to be a hypocrite on camera, which is, I guess it's either good or bad, but we'll see. But these politicians will say what they think they need to say in order to get elected by what they think is the will of the voters and not their own principles. And so they've got politics with the carriage in front of the horse.
Absolutely. And I being a spiritual person, and you mentioned God and so forth, I have a very strong feeling that there's going to be a big surprise in this election. So
I should not to give anyone the wrong impression. I'm not a religious person. I respect religion. I may be spiritual. I mean, but I do, I do live as though something is watching me, because otherwise it would be very easy to misbehave in life. So
exactly.
If it's not a God, at the very least, it's constant surveillance.
Exactly. So I have this feeling now. It could be hopeful, but I feel there's going to be a big surprise. And I think that
I
are
think you're right.
here.
I felt, but I've been wrong. I mean, I did feel this way back in 2018.
Yeah.
I guess I was right in a way, because I thought the PPC was going to pick up more votes than they did in 2018.
Mhm.
I mean, I was right and wrong. I didn't think it was going to go to the bloc, but so the bloc picked up what I thought would have been the opposition votes that would have gone to the PPC. This time around, I think people are, well, it's a different world. And now people are just, I think people are just looking at the NDP, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and well, first of all, the bloc, and they're just seeing more of the same. And so the question is, do we want to live in a country, in a province with forced mask mandates, forced vaccination mandates? And I should specify, forced vaccination mandates for this particular vaccine, which some people refuse to call a vaccine, these particular circumstances. I'm not talking about measles, whooping cough, or polio, which everyone likes to make these analogies, but they're inaccurate analogies, because polio, first of all, its effects on children was much different than the effects of COVID on children. The polio vaccine, incidentally, in the early stages was very problematic, led to a lot of problems. And as of now, though, the polio vaccine has had decades of efficacy and safety. Neither the disease nor the treatments are analogous, and people make the analogies. I'm specifically talking about now, under these set of circumstances, if people think that they want to live in this world where this can be compelled under these set of circumstances, that's what's at issue now.
And what also gives me hope is that, and I want to talk a little bit about the debate and what just kind of came out yesterday, but again, you had asked, like, if the media would just cover some more of this. It doesn't seem like they're willing to. And it seems that only from me going out and speaking to people and being at these marches and seeing the hundreds of thousands of people there, that you start to realize, and then it gets told in the first announcement in the media was a couple of hundred people. Then it was a couple thousand, a
large gathering.
But there's again, forget intention, but there really seems that there's not this presentation that there's a large group of us that may feel differently. Right?
When I said, I don't often argue intentions, this wouldn't be intentions, but this could get there. The media, I mean, once everybody appreciates that the mainstream media in Canada, the CBC and the other media outlets, are being funded by the federal government, and if it's not funded by the federal government, they're being funded by the provincial governments with COVID ad dollars, you then can make sense of the behavior. And it's not to say that, look, people do things for money. And when you realize that the federal government, can pull ads from agencies or media outlets that don't run the stories they want or are critical, like they tried to do with Radio X out of Quebec City. Once you appreciate that that's how the media operates, you can understand motivations, because people do what they need to do in order to survive, as the media is doing. But once you appreciate that the media is funded by the federal government at the federal level and by COVID ad dollars at the provincial level, you understand why they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. They're not going to create a movement that is going to counter their primary source of revenue, and then you can make sense of it. But that to me, that's the logic, and that's the obvious explanation. The media is downplaying it, utterly ignoring it, and they're basically bought off by the government, which is not how a free media is supposed to operate, which is why I'm fundamentally opposed to government subsidizing allegedly free media, because once you put money into it, or once you throw money into it, and once money comes into play, you create a link of dependence, or at the very least an expectation, and it corrupts what should otherwise be a free and independent media. But that's the easy and obvious explanation.
No objectivity there. I mean, it's
it's basically like the government's their employer. You don't criticize your boss. I mean, that's what it comes to when you are getting so much money from the government that it allows you to maintain your operations. And if anybody doesn't know what happened out of Quebec City, they tried to, they did in fact, the government stop running ads on Radio X to deprive them of the hundreds of thousands of dollars of those government ads. And then, Enterprise took the same route to try to pressure them, because they were critical of the government and they were promoting a message that the government thought undermined the government message. Well, that's how you use your subsidy and your financing as a tool to regulate and to determine content. And that is exactly how free media turns into government mouthpiece media, which is what we've seen. You see it in the States, you've seen it in other countries. It's not communist Pravda, but it's not far off. It rhymes. It's not identical, but it certainly smells similar.
And thankfully, there's alternatives, even though those are being censored and stuff like that. And it's analogous to whack-a-mole. You put us down somewhere, we come out somewhere else, but it makes it difficult, right?
And people want to know why Bill C-10 was such and it still remains to be a morally offensive proposed law. Yeah. To pretend that it's not there to protect the mainstream media on the digital platforms, you would have to not have an appreciation for the history of the law and the history of the Broadcasting Act itself. But that, now you understand why people are so shocked about that, or not you. Now your viewers will be more sensitive to the idea as to why this Bill C-10 was so shocking, because it basically seeks to regulate the only place now where you have free competition, free marketplace of ideas on the internet, because the CBC, CTV, legacy media has failed in this competition, because they've just failed. Nobody's watching them, nobody's paying attention to them, because they found alternatives and alternative sources of information, and the government doesn't necessarily like it and wants to be able to control the narrative the way they are able to on the nightly news.
Exactly. So coming back to the debate, so Maxime has not been included in the debate, as from what I understand. So
I want to see if I got any texts. No.
So I want
no news.
Reaction about that, and one of the things I think is great about your party is, my background is business and marketing, so we would call what you guys do is guerrilla marketing, which can be way more successful than kind of mainstream marketing. You're at the grassroots and the people. You have YouTubers, you have people that are very proficient that way. But tell me what you think about this, not being included in the debate and what that's going to mean for you guys.
Am I allowed swearing on your podcast?
Yes,
I'm not gonna. I'll swear like Ned Flanders. It's bullplop. It's grade A bullplop, because now I'm learning about all these things. Your leaders debate commissions setting the guidelines as to who's admissible to get into the election. I've done litigation. I did a live stream with Richard Barris, a pollster out of the United States, who's been much more accurate than the Nate Silvers and whatever the other pollsters are in the States. Pew polls. He's been more accurate than all of them. But when you understand that the polling industry itself is fundamentally corrupt as well, for the exact same reasons the media is corrupt when they start taking government dollars, when you realize that pollsters can affect the results of a poll by the framing of the question, the ordering of the question, the times they go to find people to poll, the means through which they do this, you realize that polls are, goes back to the Disraeli expression, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Polls they're not just fundamentally unreliable, they're fundamentally reliable in that you can use them to get whatever results you want. You can use them to achieve whatever results you want. So when you learn that the Leaders Debate Commission, the criteria is that in order to be invited to the Leaders Debate, you have to be polling at least 4% of intention among pollers, from 9 days before the election is called to 5 days after, for any poll taken in that time frame, from reputable pollsters, the weighted average of those reputable pollsters. First of all, if you can still understand what I'm saying right now, then you're one step ahead of the game. But the bottom line, once you see the variance of these polls in order to determine that Maxime Bernier allegedly did not reach the 4%, even though many reputable pollsters have him polling at 6% and over now, you realize, okay, if one pollster says that their results were that 0.7% of the population is voting PPC, and two other pollsters equally reputable have it at 5.2%. That's a 700% variance among reputable pollsters. Their polls are not worth the paper they're written on. And if people don't appreciate that, well, then you get into the situation where, we took 9 of our reputable pollsters. One had the PPC polling at under 1%. 3 had him at between 3 and 5%. 2 had him over 5%. But the average to that is under 4%, so he doesn't get invited, and yet the Green Party still gets invited. It's bullplop. And when you think about the fact that this is a federal party that has a candidate in virtually every riding, and if they don't have one in every riding by the end of this, they're going to have them in over 300 of the 338 federal ridings, to deny the leader of that party the stage to debate with the other leaders, you disenfranchise and you disillusion your citizenry, and you create the impression that the process it might be being fortified by forces that are not pure democratic forces.
Yes, and I want to get into that in a little bit more, because I think the people that I speak to and have been speaking to a lot over the last few weeks are really starting to feel demoralized, and that there isn't as much hope. And one of the things that people are concerned about is they saw what happened in the competition in the U.S. and wonder, has this been going on around the world? We're hearing about
Oh, and look, we know it's been going on. It goes on everywhere. I mean, we know that. The only question is, does it also go on in our free and democratic Western societies? First of all, one thing before I forget, anybody who's feeling demoralized, you do not have the right to feel demoralized until after you've lost. And even then, if you've lost and did everything you could, don't feel demoralized. But don't get demoralized before you lose. That's what. Remain optimistic, and then when you lose, okay, then you can get demoralized, and then you have to
dust yourself off. And this is
it. And then what do I do now? But we've read that Time article. How a secret cabal of interests fortified the election or saved the elections. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I like to say I'm a conspiracy analyst, but that's the joke. I read that Time article magazine. I agree with everything in that magazine. That is not how democracy should work. And when people start getting the feeling that a private cabal of interests are meeting with the media to determine the messaging, what gets to whom, then you're not living in a democracy. You're living, I think the word is an oligarchy. But when looking at the pollsters here determining who gets invited to the federal leaders debate, I get the impression that, any pollster on earth can yield whatever results they want. And setting aside the margin of errors, when you have 9 reputable pollsters who are off by such wildly varying degrees, you have rules that were set to yield the results you want. A more common sense practice would be, I'd say, look at if a federal party has a sufficient number of candidates in ridings, they deserve to be on that stage, because that means that they are speaking to people across Canada.
Exactly.
But I mean, but those aren't the rules. That's not how they were set up. So they have this nebulous criteria of polling at 4% 9 days before the election is called to 5 days after. First of all, why would any poll taken 9 days before the election is called be relevant for anything? On its face? The only reason it'll be relevant for anything is because you can yield whatever results you want, because there's going to be a radical change between 9 days before the election is called and 5 days after. And that can swing both ways.
Yeah, exactly. And we saw what happened with the polls in the United States too. Last couple of
even this year, even though Biden is president, the polls were wildly off. I mean, they were wildly off in 2016, but even though the outcome was, what it was this year in the States, the polls and the pollsters were wildly off to the point where they have discredited themselves as an industry. So to determine any protocol for a federal election on these results from these polling agencies, I think it's questionable to begin with. I wouldn't be complaining if Maxime had made it on, but as it is now, looking at the criteria, looking at the results, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. And, you're speaking to a really more of an English Quebec audience. So I don't think there'll be a lot of people that would be voting for the Bloc. But I also reach out to the rest of Canada and so forth. But what about the Bloc? Are they a reasonable alternative to what's going on? I see that a bit.
The funny thing is, ordinarily they would be a protest alternative, because they would want to be opposition to the federal government. I think the idea of having a federal party whose platform is predicated on separating from the federation is fundamentally contradictory, but whatever. I mean, they're entitled to be there. They're not a viable option, not because of their stance on Quebec separation, but because of their stance on the lockdowns, on the vaccine mandates. They're no different than any other political party out there. They're different in that they want Quebec to separate. And at this point, I guarantee you they have a lot of support from out west. People out west saying, yeah, good, separate, get out of here, because you guys out east are the ones keeping Trudeau in power, locking us down out west, or at least imposing these mandates on us out west. So they're not a viable alternative, but not because of their position on separation. I respect their position on separation, even if I disagree with it. I understand it and respect it. They're not a viable option because they're no different on the fundamental issues that are the heart of this election now. The only The only alternative, I mean, I don't know if there's a communist party. I don't think they'd be any better. But the only alternative in terms of actually being meaningful and valid and substantive opposition to the powers that be right now are the People's Party of Canada. People need to understand that. People need to understand also PPC is not going to win a majority and Maxime Bernier be elected prime minister now. Politics is sort of a longer term game, and you have to start somewhere, and you have to create a world in which people are not shy to say that they support the PPC, because the PPC has been demonized, as have their followers, and so people are shy, reluctant. They don't want to get canceled. They don't want to feel the backlash of, when I went door to door, the shock in people's faces. They've known me for years. I've lived in this house for 11 years. I've been in this neighborhood my entire life. And people know me for a number of reasons. When I say I'm running with the PPC, it was like that episode. It was like that episode in Breaking Bad when Walter White tells I forget exactly what happened, but he's like, I don't even know who you are. I tell people I'm running with the PPC. It's like they think they're staring at the devil all of a sudden, and they don't realize, yeah, PPC members can be ethnic minorities, religious minorities, fathers, loving parents, loving community members, and we are. And that's exactly why I think I am PPC, is that I respect my neighbors' kids and don't think that they should have their lives and their futures compromised if they make certain decisions for themselves. And so the trick is, though, you have to get people to be sensitized to that, and you're never going to turn everybody. But once more people start seeing that, PPC is mainstream, moral, thoughtful, socially conscientious people, and not fringe radicals who are climate deniers and anti-vaxxers, then more people will feel comfortable supporting them, coming out as being one, and that's how things change.
Yeah, and just to kind of go, we have a few more minutes if you have just a couple more
Go for it.
questions. Is that in some ways, some of these kind of quote unquote values, environment, immigration, so forth, a bit hijacked by the left, if you will. And like you said, I've voted for other parties. I voted for every party, I think, the Green, the NDP, the last two, Trudeau. Sorry to say at this point, but,
don't worry. Hey,
but
I voted for François Legault. I will never do it again.
There you go, exactly. So I want to just talk about the two things that, besides what we've just talked about, that maybe are criticized or demonized about, is the environment. Because I actually heard somebody that said, I'm going to vote for them even though I have to hold my nose about their issues on the environment.
People are grossly misinformed on the PPC being anti-environment. Yeah. This is the iron. You are not, this is how the media has successfully framed the debate. Unless you are pro-carbon tax, or let me rephrase, if you are anti-carbon tax, you're anti-environment. First of all, I will challenge anyone to find me someone who loves nature more than me. We may be tied out there.
I think I
love nature. I love camping. I love swimming in rivers. I love fishing, hiking, rock climbing. I love nature, and I'm about preserving it. And I'm actually about implementing policy that does that. But to say that if you're anti-carbon tax, you're anti-environment, is to mischaracterize the debate. Nobody in the PPC denies climate change. They might say climate is changing, humans are polluting. Whether or not it is changing only because humans are polluting, arguable, but we all agree humans are polluting, climate is changing, pollution is bad. We all agree. Now the issue is a carbon tax justifiable? Is a carbon tax economical? And is the carbon tax environmental? Is the Paris Accord actually going to do anything to improve the environment? Or is it just going to cripple Western economies who are ultimately going to outsource their pollution, as they're doing, to China and India, the biggest polluters on earth? So the party is just not by no means anti-environment. The party is pro-environment. And then the question is, how do you actually protect the environment? By imposing carbon taxes? I say no. I say, creating industries out of the environment are how you protect the environment. Having manufacturing be done locally in an environmentally sustainable way is good for the environment and good for the economy. But what you do here is you impose a carbon tax. Companies don't give a sweet bugger all. They either slap that additional price onto their goods, or they outsource it to China and India for manufacturing, as they do. It gets manufactured with as much, if not more, pollution in China and India. Then it's going to get shipped over here, and then we buy it because it's cheaper, and we've crippled our economy, We've become dependent on foreign nations for imported goods, and the pollution is not getting any better. And incidentally, in the first year of the carbon tax, I mean, I don't know how long it takes to see results. I haven't seen any net positive for the environment. So you're not. It's good. The media has framed it in a way to say if you're anti-carbon tax, you're anti-environment. PPC is objectively anti-carbon tax and against the Paris Accord, and therefore you get to call them anti-environment. It's a false dichotomy. And the party, if the party were anti-environment, I wouldn't be here. Mm-hmm. Second thing, xenophobic and racist and anti-immigrant. These are discussions that I've had with immigrant Canadians who say, first of all, because I said on my channel, Viva, I like what you said, because when people say that you're racist if you're anti-immigrant, you ignore the lawful immigrants in Canada, you ignore the ethnic minorities in Canada by pretending that everyone in Canada is white, and if you don't want immigrants coming in, you somehow only care about white people. It is again a misframing of the debate. When we have Indigenous populations in Canada who don't have clean drinking water, when you have Indigenous populations who are suffering from homelessness, drug addiction, when you have minorities and students who, I forget what it was, like 1 in 4, 1 in 5 students are malnourished or don't have enough food to eat. When you have those issues going on in society and your focus is on immigration, you are effectively saying, I care more about non-citizens than I do about existing citizens of all races, religions, ethnicities, and creeds. And I would even argue that the liberal stance on immigration is itself more racist, because what it fundamentally presupposes is that immigrants are ethnic minorities, and the justification for bringing a lot of immigration in is for cheap labor. And to look at immigration under that light is itself fundamentally racist. But like I always say on my channel, hashtag confession through projection, I found that oftentimes these accusations of racism are coming from the people with the dirtiest pasts imaginable. But the idea that Canadians are white is wrong. The idea that the PPC wants to focus on Canadians first and Canadian issues first, and then we can tackle, take in who we can take in responsibly, that is responsible, and that is fundamentally tolerant to everyone in Canada.
Awesome. So what do you say to people that kind of either they don't want to vote or they just feel like the system's broken? You can't work within the system anymore. I have young people, my sons in particular, that generation, they're looking at what's going on. And yes, you're a voice of reason, but the system you're going to be trying to get into is so broken.
It's an interesting thing. The last election, I think I put out a video, just a fun family vlog about going to vote. And I was shocked that it had a higher downvote ratio than any other video I'd put out. And a lot of people saying, by voting, you are tacitly accepting the corruption of the system. Well, you know what? If you're not going to vote, that's going to be a tacit acceptance as well. So you may as well, if you're going to tacitly accept, I don't accept the argument, but it's going to be a tacit acceptance one way or the other. You may as well tacitly accept by making your voice known. But I don't think it's tacit acceptance of a corrupt system. I do think magic happens. It has happened historically. Whether you like Trump or you hate Trump, magic happened in 2016. Was it a glitch in the system? Did they not fortify it enough? I don't know. But every now and again, it happens. The people get up and they speak. And hopefully, we're seeing it hopefully happening in Australia. If nothing else than the protests on the street. It will never happen unless every avalanche, what's the expression? It was a bad expression. It says the avalanche never feels guilty because every individual snowflake doesn't feel guilty. But at the end of the day, the biggest of avalanches are caused by a grouping of individual snowflakes that can have massive effects. So you can be discouraged. You can be discouraged before, during, and after. But if you resign, then you're not. Then you're doing nothing to either make the situation better or to change the system. So, doing nothing has never been an option. I've never heard so many
people saying they're going off the grid. That's their plan.
Well, I mean, first of all, when it comes to a government, you can never be far enough off the grid to an ever increasingly tyrannical government. So you may be prolonging, or you may be delaying it for yourself, but you can never be far enough off the grid in today's day and age when the government can use bank accounts to, once they cut off your bank account, it doesn't matter how far off the grid you are, unless you can literally live with nothing and on your own. But if that's the option, fine, that's the option. But no, resigning your fate to there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not there yet. I'll never be there. I'm stubborn. I'm still optimistic despite all of this. And I do feel that something of an avalanche is coming this election cycle. And I hope to goodness this interview ages well and I don't look like an idiot who was just totally brainwashed by his own silo. I think something big is going to happen politically, but that means everybody not getting discouraged before. Go gung-ho and tell everybody, get everyone involved, and you will find out that there are more people that think like us, like we're some underground thing. It's crazy. Who think
exactly
about freedom and who think about futures and think about their own futures and the futures of their kids than are publicly vocalizing it. But I can understand people getting discouraged when they see people losing their jobs for not getting vaccinated, denied transportation, whatever. Don't get discouraged until you've lost, and then even then be discouraged, but then get back up and figure it out
and find new ways. Yeah. The one other thing I hear is I know you've heard this a lot, by giving you guys the vote, it's taking away from the conservative. We've already told why we don't want them, but at least it reduces the majority potential for Trudeau. So it's kind of giving a vote for him. So what would you say?
First of all, I think the conservatives are splitting the liberal vote right now. I don't think the PPC is splitting the conservative vote. That's what my appreciation of that. Okay. But the flip side, even if you do think that, voting for the lesser of the evils, you're still voting for evil. So you and the conservatives, I'm not saying that they're evil in the literal sense.
Yeah.
They're not defending the Constitution any more than the liberals. So good, vote for them. You'll lose your rights slower. I mean, it's like at some point you have to take a stand politically. But I genuinely do not think that the PPC is splitting votes from the conservatives. I genuinely think the conservatives at this point in time are splitting votes with the liberals, which maybe that was their long game. Maybe O'Toole will say, I'm going to get so liberal, I'm going to confuse liberals. I'm going to get the liberals who are so fed up with Trudeau's corruption and lack of ethics that I'm going to get them to vote conservative. Maybe that's what they're doing. But nobody is splitting the PPC vote here. I think the PPC vote are people who are fundamentally fed up now with what they see in the government, and rightly so.
Awesome. And what about the ridings where there are no candidates? What do those people that live in those regions, what can they do? Is there anything?
I hadn't thought about that. I think I don't need to think about that. I think there are going to be getting so few ridings in which the PPC are not going to have a candidate that I don't know. Protest vote for the bloc if you're out west and you don't have I'm joking. People will vote for whomever they want to, candidate or not. But from what I understand, the PPC is going to have candidates in virtually every riding.
What's the deadline for that? Do you know for the candidates?
The deadline is August 30th to get the 100 signatures approved by Elections Canada. Okay. I think it's August 30th at 2:00. Don't anyone quote me on that date, but it was 21 days before the election that the 100 signatures of eligible voters in the riding has to be approved by Elections Canada at 2:00.
Okay. I almost want to move to another place just to become a candidate.
Well, if for anybody who's watching this now, and if you're in NDG Notre Dame, other than voting, I don't tell anybody who to vote for. Just sensitize people and get them out to vote. Mm-hmm. And just share the message, because people are resigned, and also people are not living in silos, but people are not necessarily getting exposure to different types of media. So they're sitting there listening to CTV and CBC. Talk to people, just get them aware of what's going on. They will make their own rational decisions at the end of the day. And we all think we know what the rational decision is. Come on.
Yeah, and we need the guerrilla marketing, right? We need the podcasts, the videos, the sharing across social media.
Billboards. I think we just ordered 200 billboards. I ensured that they're recyclable, corrugated, recyclable billboards, because I can't stand the election waste. Yeah. We just ordered 200 billboards, but I think billboards are useless. It's a question of how do you getting a message nationally or viewed on social media is one thing, but then to get elected, you need people in your district to vote for you. So that's where my focus is. I want people in Notre Dame de Grâce and Westmount to know that there is a viable alternative to the Trudeau corruption and reckless government. And it's not just conservative, because the conservatives are no better now. They're only better insofar as they haven't been in power to be corrupt the same way Justin Trudeau has. But as far as the substantive issues go, they're no better. People just need to know there is a trustworthy, uncorrupted, and uncorruptible candidate, and that is me.
I love it. I love it. I'm just going to ask one last question. For those, or two actually, one, I'll just ask if there's anything else you want to share. But before that is for us, we can vote, we can share and so forth. Is there anything else that Canadians and Quebecers, as you're a Quebecer, we can do to help protect our freedoms? There's one of the things I keep hearing, people are mandating it in the workplace, but there's labor laws that say that they can't mandate it. And I'm talking to different leaders in industry who are saying, this is going to cause a huge labor shortage. We can't just do this. Striking, class action suits schools. Are there anything else that we can do as Canadians and Quebecers as this election's happening to help us?
Well, it's tough. The courts have not come. The courts thus far have not come to the defense of the citizens for citizen rights. I'm not any more optimistic that they would on other issues. I think we've gone into a full frenzy where, we have labor laws, but then you also have employment laws, which the employer must create a safe workspace. And so now that's being used as the justification to impose vaccination, because that's how you create a safe workspace. So even these labor laws are going to be read both ways, but the courts haven't been coming in on the side of constitutional freedoms, and I'm not optimistic they will. The solution is a political one, and then the question is, how do you get people to put that political pressure out there? And it's a long way and a hard way to do it. Talk to people. I like calling in radio shows, letting people know that there are people out there who think differently. If you listen to CJAD, you'd think that everyone, the only question was lockdowns or more lockdowns. Call in, radio shows, have the discussion. Social media, just voice your piece, and it will resonate. And the more it resonates, the more it resonates. It's the ripple effect. And so that's it. I mean, it's just more discussion, more involvement, more grassroots organizations. Yes, striking. I don't really tell people to do certain things because people will do them on their own. Peaceful protests, but at the end of the day, vocalizing your grievances, and it will build on itself. Courage is contagious at the end of the day.
I love it. What I also believe is creating community. When we come together and support each other, I can't tell you the number of people every day saying, I'm alone, I don't know where to go, my friends and family have shunned me. Creating that community, not only online, but we gather, we meet online, we meet, as well together. And I also help people with their businesses so that they can, if they can't work a certain way, they can work another way. And so I think there's going to be these parallel communities that have to kind of spread out as well.
Absolutely. At one point, I think it was Dan Bongino who talked about it on his podcast. There's going to be a parallel economy if this keeps going, because there's going to be people who don't want, the only question is going to be whether or not the government effectively says you can't even run a business unless you set up these requirements.
Then it'll be a black web.
Well, no, for sure. And then it's just a question of how far it goes. But I think some of these measures are gonna meet a sufficient amount of protest that the government is going to step back, like they did in the States when they tried to do the same thing. Right. It just takes more time, but at the end of the day, yes, community, messaging, and just getting the message out there and letting people know that they're not alone. There's no shame in this, and in fact, people should feel tremendous pride in valuing these constitutional freedoms, because they were not created out of nowhere, and they were not created because they were not the most meaningful thing on earth in order to create the societies that we have in Canada and the United States. So the more people realize how valuable they are, and they're unapologetic about defending them, we're going to see the tide shifting. But it'll happen slowly, but big ships turn slowly, but once they do, they are difficult to stop. So hopefully we're getting to the point of turning.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell people before we close off?
I think we've covered it all, but I just say, don't give up and don't lead to despair. And also, something I say all the time on my channel, I think it was Nietzsche. I'm fairly certain it was Nietzsche. When battling monsters, be sure not to become the monster. And that is something that people have to forget, never forget, have to always remember, is that the ends do not justify the means, and that is what separates some from others. We cannot become the evil that we're trying to fight, and we cannot become the monster that we're trying to defeat. So however much despair you feel, bear that in mind, and the world has gotten through darker times, and the world will get through these dark times, but you do not want to become the source of darkness that you're trying to fight.
Thank you so much. That was a perfect way to end. And I really appreciate your time with us, and
My
hope
pleasure.
people will share. I'll put all your links in here as well so that they can go directly to you. So thank
Awesome.
you very much.
Thank you.